The President's Shadow, Jefferson's Secret. There's a room at Monticello that tour guides don't like to talk about. It belonged to a woman named Sally Hemings. She was 14 years old when she became Thomas Jefferson's property, 16 when she became something else entirely. For decades, she lived in the shadow of one of America's most celebrated presidents, the man who wrote that all men are created equal. She bore his children in secret, 6 of them. This is the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, a story about power, betrayal, and the lies America told itself for 200 years. Thomas Jefferson, 3rd President of the United States, Founding Father, visionary, the man who penned the Declaration of Independence, those soaring words about liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness. He was a philosopher, an architect, a scholar who filled his library with thousands of books and his letters with ideas that would shape a nation. To the world, he was a champion of freedom, a man who believed in human dignity. But history has a dark side, and Jefferson's dark side was more intense than anyone dared to speak aloud. Because while he preached liberty to the world, behind the elegant columns of his Virginia estate, he lived a very different truth. A truth the world wasn't supposed to know. Her name was Sally Hemings. She was born into slavery in 1773 on a Virginia plantation. She never chose her life. She never had a choice. By the time she was 14 years old, she belonged to Thomas Jefferson. Not as a daughter, not as a citizen, as property. Sally wasn't just any enslaved woman on Jefferson's expansive Monticello estate. She worked inside the mansion itself, in the intimate, private quarters where only the most trusted servants were allowed. She was light-skinned. Some historians believe she was beautiful, but more importantly, she was powerless. And she was young. So terribly young. Sally Hemings was also Thomas Jefferson's late wife's half-sister. Yes, you heard that right. Jefferson's father-in-law had begetted Sally with one of his own enslaved women, which meant that Sally and Jefferson's deceased wife, Martha, shared the same father. It's a twisted, uncomfortable truth, but it's essential to understanding what came next. The relationship likely began in Paris. Jefferson was serving as the American ambassador to France in 1787. His daughter accompanied him, and so did Sally Hemings, brought along as her companion, her servant. Paris in the 1780s was a world away from Virginia. It was a city of philosophy, art, revolution. The French were questioning monarchy, slavery, the very foundations of power. And here's the thing. Under French law, enslaved people could theoretically petition for their freedom. But theory and reality were very different things. Sally was 14 years old. She spoke no French. She had no money, no connections, no one to turn to in a foreign city. The legal right to freedom meant nothing without the power to claim it. And Thomas Jefferson was 44. He was powerful, educated, charismatic. She was a child who had been owned her entire life. What happened between them in Paris wasn't romance. It was power. And when Jefferson prepared to return to America 2 years later, Sally faced an impossible choice. Stay in France, theoretically free but utterly alone, with no resources and no support, or return to slavery with Jefferson. According to her son Madison's testimony decades later, Jefferson made her a promise. He would free their children when they turned 21. She returned with him. She was 16. And soon after, she would give birth to her first child. Over the next 2 decades, Sally Hemings gave birth to at least 6 children. Thomas Jefferson was the father of all, for survived to adulthood: Beverly, Harriet, Madison, and Eston. But here's what makes this story so devastating. Jefferson never publicly acknowledged them. Not once. These children, his own flesh and blood, grew up as slaves on his estate. They called him master. They watched him entertain guests, host dignitaries, write letters about human freedom, and they kept silent because they had no choice. Jefferson kept records very carefully. He documented everything, every crop, every expense, every enslaved person on his property. But in his official records, Sally's children appear only as numbers. Names on a list. Property. He freed them as promised, but he did it quietly, discreetly. Beverly and Harriet were allowed to simply walk away in their early 20s. No legal paperwork, no fanfare. They disappeared into white society, their true identities buried forever. Madison and Eston were freed in Jefferson's will, but even then, Jefferson never named them as his sons. Picture this: Thomas Jefferson standing before the nation, delivering speeches about liberty, writing letters condemning tyranny, then returning home to Monticello, where his own children were servers in his house, where the woman who shared his bed had no legal rights, no freedom, no voice. This is the contradiction at the heart of Jefferson's life. He believed, or claimed to believe, that slavery was morally wrong. He wrote about it. He called it a moral depravity. But he owned over 600 human beings throughout his lifetime. He knew slavery was evil, and he participated in it anyway. He fathered children with Sally Hemings for more than 2 decades. But he never freed her during his lifetime. When he died in 1826, Sally was still legally enslaved. Jefferson's daughter Martha eventually allowed her to live as a free woman in her final years, though she was never formally liberated. She died in 1835, nameless in official records, invisible to history. For nearly 2 centuries, Jefferson's family denied everything. His white descendants called the rumors lies, slander, politically motivated attacks. They pointed to Jefferson's reputation, his intellect, his moral philosophy. A man like that, they said, would never do such a thing. But the rumors had started during Jefferson was still alive. In 1802, a journalist named James Callender published the story. He wrote about dusky Sally and her children at Monticello. The public was scandalized, but Jefferson never responded, never denied it, never confirmed it. He simply stayed silent, and his family closed ranks. For generations, they insisted that one of Jefferson's nephews was the real father. They offered alternative explanations. They controlled the narrative, because admitting the truth would have shattered the legend. It would have forced America to confront an ugly reality, that one of its greatest heroes was also a man who abused his power in the most intimate, personal way imaginable. Historians avoided the topic. Textbooks ignored it. Sally Hemings and her children were erased from the official story. They became footnotes, whispers. But the truth has a way of surfacing. In 1998, nearly 200 years after Jefferson's death, scientists conducted DNA testing on the descendants of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. The results were undeniable. There was a genetic match. Thomas Jefferson had fathered at least one, and almost certainly all, of Sally Hemings' children. The evidence was overwhelming. The family denials crumbled. Slowly, painfully, mainstream history began to change. Monticello, Jefferson's estate, finally acknowledged the relationship. Museums updated their exhibits. Textbooks were rewritten. Sally Hemings was no longer a rumor. She was real, and so were her children. But here's what haunts me. It took DNA evidence to make people believe her descendants. Their own testimony, passed down through generations, wasn't enough. The word of Black Americans wasn't enough. It took science to validate what they had been saying all along. So, what do we do with Thomas Jefferson now? Do we tear down his statues? Erase his name from history? Or do we accept that human beings are capable of both brilliance and monstrosity? This is the uncomfortable truth. Jefferson wrote words that inspired revolutions, ideas that changed the world. And he also enslaved people, had children with a woman who could not legally say no, lived a lie for decades. He was a genius. He was a hypocrite. He was both. Some people want to defend him, to separate the man from his ideas, to say he was a product of his time. But Sally Hemings lived in that same time, and she had no power, no choice, no voice. Others want to condemn him completely, to reduce him to a villain and nothing more. But history is rarely that simple. The truth is messy, painful, contradictory. Jefferson's legacy is a mirror. It reflects the best of what America wants to be, and the worst of what it has always been. Here's what breaks my heart. We will never hear Sally Hemings' side of the story in her own words. She left behind no letters,
no diary,
no written testimony. What we know comes from her son, Madison Hemings, who told their story to a journalist in 1873, nearly 40 years after his mother's death. His statement, combined with historical records and family oral histories, gives us the fragments we have today. But Sally herself remains silent in the historical record. We don't know what she thought, what she felt, what she dreamed about in the darkness of her room at Monticello. We don't know if there were moments of tenderness, or if it was only survival. We don't know if she whispered her truth to her children, or if the silence was too heavy to break. She was erased intentionally. Her story was inconvenient, dangerous, so it was buried. And for 200 years, America pretended she didn't matter. Think about Jefferson's children with Sally. Beverly and Harriet walked away from Monticello and vanished into white society. They changed their names, hid their heritage, married white spouses. Their descendants today may have no idea who their ancestor was. They lived as white Americans, carrying a secret they could never tell. Because in 19th century America, even a single drop of black blood could destroy your life. Madison and Eston stayed connected to their black heritage, at least for a time. But even they were caught between worlds. Too black to claim their father publicly, too white to fully belong anywhere. This is the legacy of Jefferson's secrecy. Not just hidden children, but fractured identities, lost histories, families torn apart by a lie. Today, you can visit Monticello. You can walk the same halls where Jefferson wrote, where he dined with presidents and philosophers. And if you pay attention, you'll find Sally Hemings there too now. There's a small exhibit, a plaque. Her room has been restored, but it's still his house, his legacy. She remains in the margins even now, a footnote in his story, rather than the author of her own. Tourists come to admire Jefferson's brilliance, and many still struggle to hold both truths at once. That this place was built by enslaved hands. That the man who championed freedom denied it to the people closest to him. Monticello is beautiful, and it's haunted. This isn't just about Thomas Jefferson. It's about power, about who gets to tell the story, about whose voices are silenced, and whose are amplified. For 2 centuries, America chose Jefferson's version of history, the sanitized version, the heroic version. Sally Hemings' truth was inconvenient, so it was dismissed. Her descendants were called liars, until DNA proved them right. This is a pattern that repeats throughout history. The powerful write the narrative. The powerless are erased, until someone, someday, digs deep enough to find the truth. Thomas Jefferson died on July 4, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Declaration of Independence. It was seen as a sign, a symbol, proof of his greatness. But on that same day, Sally Hemings was still enslaved, still invisible, still carrying the secret that would haunt American history for 200 years. Jefferson got his legacy: monuments, mountains, currency, universities bearing his name. Sally Hemings got silence. Until now, her story is finally being told, not as a scandal, not as a footnote, but as the truth. A truth that forces us to reckon with the contradictions at the heart of American history. That the man who wrote, "All men are created equal," didn't believe it applied to everyone. That freedom and slavery existed side by side, under the same roof, in the same man's heart. And that the cost of that hypocrisy was paid by people who had no choice. People like Sally Hemings. People whose names we're only now learning to speak. This is her story, and it will not be erased again.